name is Elias Thorne, and I am, by nature, a man who seeks the quiet corners of the world, not out of misanthropy, but from a deep-seated need for clarity, for the kind of silence that allows thoughts to unfurl without the constant static of urban life. For years, I'd navigated the labyrinthine corridors of corporate law, my days a relentless barrage of deadlines, demanding clients, and the suffocating hum of fluorescent lights. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of opportunity, had slowly become a cage, its ceaseless clamor a constant assault on my nerves. My left hand, a constant companion since my early 20s, would often betray a tremor, a subtle vibration that no amount of deep breathing or chamomile tea could truly quell. It was a physical manifestation of the internal discord, a quiet rebellion against the relentless pace. I was, by most accounts, meticulous. My suits were always pressed, my desk organized to a fault, my arguments in court structured with an almost surgical precision. This meticulousness, a trait that served me well in my profession, was also a shield, a way to impose order on a world that often felt chaotic. It was this very trait that led me to the Oregon Department of Forestry's job posting. Fire lookout, remote station. The description, brief and to the point, spoke of solitude, vigilance, and an almost monastic existence. It promised an escape, a chance to find silence in the vastness of Oregon's wilderness, to trade the concrete jungle for ancient forests. It was a desperate yearning, a primal urge to shed the layers of expectation and simply be. My only thought was to escape the city's suffocating grip, to find silence in the vastness of Oregon. The interview had been brief, conducted over a crackling phone line that seemed to underscore the very remoteness of the position. They asked about my experience with solitude, my ability to handle emergencies, my comfort with heights. I answered with the practiced calm of a man who had argued far more complex cases, omitting the part about my growing aversion to crowds and the way the city's noise had begun to feel like a physical weight. I packed with the same meticulous care I applied to legal briefs, each item chosen for its utility and resilience. My worn leather-bound journal, a ritual before any new assignment, was tucked securely into my pack, its blank pages a silent invitation for new observations, new thoughts. My voice, usually steady, cracked only slightly as I confirmed my acceptance, betraying the fatigue that clung to me, a wariness that went deeper than mere lack of sleep. A familiar dread coiled in my stomach, the kind that whispered of isolation and forgotten places. But it was a dread I welcomed, a known quantity compared to the insidious anxiety of my former life. The journey to the lookout was a descent, both literal and metaphorical. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to a winding dirt track, barely wide enough for my old, reliable pickup truck. The air grew cooler, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The towering Douglas firs, ancient sentinels, pressed in on either side, their branches forming a dense canopy that swallowed the sunlight. The silence, initially a welcome balm, began to deepen, becoming less a peaceful absence of sound and more a profound, almost oppressive presence. It was the kind of silence that made the subtle rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a hawk feel amplified, unnervingly close. My destination, the Blackwood Peak Lookout, emerged from the dense forest like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. It was a tall, weathered wooden tower perched precariously on a rocky outcrop, its glass enclosed cabin a solitary eye surveying an endless expanse of green. The structure itself seemed to breathe, groaning softly in the shifting breeze, its timbers creaking with the weight of years and untold stories. This was not just a building, it was a character, a silent, watchful entity that had witnessed countless sunrises and sunsets, countless storms and quiet days. As I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs, each step echoed in the stillness, a stark reminder of my solitude. The air inside the cabin was cool, carrying a faint, musty scent of old wood and something else, something indefinable, like forgotten memories. The single, pane windows, grimy with dust, offered panoramic views that were breathtaking yet unsettling. The vastness of the wilderness stretched out in every direction, an unbroken tapestry of trees, distant peaks, and a sky that seemed impossibly large. There was no sign of human habitation for miles, no distant lights, no faint hum of traffic, just the wind, the trees, and the profound, echoing silence. The Oregon fire lookouts have a rich history, born from a necessity to protect these very forests from the ravages of wildfire. In their heyday, hundreds of these cabins and towers dotted the high points of the state, staffed by men and women who embraced the isolation, their lives dictated by the rhythm of the seasons and the constant vigilance required. Many have since been abandoned, replaced by more modern detection methods, leaving behind only ghosts of their former purpose. Blackwood Peak, I knew, was one of the few still actively staffed, a relic in a world that had largely moved on. This historical context, initially a source of romantic appeal, now lent an unsettling weight to the silence, a sense of being part of a fading, almost forgotten, tradition. My first few hours were spent settling in, unpacking my meager belongings, and familiarizing myself with the cramped living space. The previous lookout, a man named Silas, had left the place surprisingly tidy, almost too tidy. There was a sense of abrupt departure, as if he'd simply walked out one day and never looked back. On the small, scarred wooden desk, next to the firefinder instrument, I noticed a stack of neatly organized logbooks. Beneath them, almost hidden by a loose corner of the desk blotter, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was thick, yellowed, and felt strangely heavy in my hand. My fingers traced the faint creases, a sense of anticipation, cold and sharp, prickling at my skin. I unfolded it slowly. The paper was covered in neat, precise handwriting, a stark contrast to the rough texture of the paper itself. It was a list of rules. My breath hitched. Rules for a fire lookout. The job description hadn't mentioned any special protocols beyond the standard fire detection procedures. This wasn't a list of duties. It was something else entirely. The first rule, written in bold, almost aggressive script, immediately set an unsettling tone. 1. Never, under any circumstances, leave the lookout after sunset. A shiver, not from the cool mountain air, traced its way down my spine. The sun was already dipping below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. The shadows in the cabin were lengthening, stretching like grasping fingers across the floorboards. The silence outside, once a comfort, now felt like a held breath, waiting. I read on, my eyes scanning the cryptic instructions. Each rule was a small, unsettling puzzle piece, hinting at unseen dangers that lurked within the isolated wilderness. They spoke of things that moved in the periphery, sounds that shouldn't be heard, and precautions that defied logic. The last guy, Silas, had left more than just a job. He had left a legacy of dread, a chilling testament to whatever he had encountered out here. His absence, coupled with the tangible presence of his rules, immediately created intrigue and a sense of inherited dread. The very existence of these rules implied a history, a reason for their creation, and a previous encounter with whatever necessitated them. It was as if Silas, in his abrupt departure, had bequeathed me not just a job, but a preordained nightmare. The meticulousness I usually embraced now felt like a vulnerability, a susceptibility to the precise, unsettling order of these instructions. My mind, accustomed to dissecting legal texts, immediately began to analyze, to search for the hidden meaning behind each chilling directive. As dusk deepened, the first faint flicker of the cabin's single electric lantern seemed to struggle against the encroaching gloom. The wind outside picked up, a low, mournful whistle around the eaves of the tower. I found myself instinctively checking the locks on the heavy wooden door, a gesture I hadn't considered necessary just hours before. The vast, beautiful wilderness outside had, in the space of a single, unsettling discovery, transformed into something else entirely. It was no longer just a landscape, it was a stage, and I, Elias Thorne, was now the reluctant, isolated player in a drama whose rules had just been laid out by a ghost. The tremor in my left hand, usually a subtle companion, now pulsed with a new, unsettling rhythm. It was no longer just anxiety, it was fear, and it had only just begun. The list of rules felt impossibly heavy in my hand, a thin sheet of paper imbued with the weight of an unspoken history. My initial reaction was a strange cocktail of disbelief and a prickle of professional curiosity. Rules? For a fire lookout, it seemed absurd. My legal mind, trained to dissect and categorize, immediately sought to rationalize them. Perhaps Silas, the previous lookout, had been eccentric, a man who found comfort in rigid structure, even for the mundane. Or perhaps, a more unsettling thought whispered, he had been unwell. I smoothed the paper on the scarred desk, the single electric lantern casting long, dancing shadows that made the words seem to writhe. The first rule, bold and stark, still resonated with an icy clarity one. Never, under any circumstances, leave the lookout after sunset. My gaze drifted to the windows, now black mirrors reflecting the cabin's dim interior. Outside, the world was a canvas of impenetrable darkness, the towering pines swallowed by an inky void. The wind, which had been a mournful whistle earlier, now seemed to sigh, a long, drawn-out exhalation that pressed against the glass. A simple safety precaution, I tried to tell myself. Bears, cuggers, getting lost in the dark. But the phrasing, the absolute finality of never, under any circumstances, suggested something far more sinister than mere wildlife. I took a deep, shaky breath and forced myself to read on, each line a new thread in a tightening web. 2. The emergency lantern must burn from dusk till dawn. Do not let it extinguish. My eyes darted to the small, oil-fueled lantern on a shelf near the door. It looked old, its brass tarnished, its wick barely visible. Another safety measure, I reasoned, in case the electricity fails. But again, the insistence, the imperative, do not let it extinguish, hinted at a deeper purpose. Was it a beacon, a ward, or was there something out there, something that feared the light? The thought sent a fresh shiver down my spine. The silence outside, which had initially been a welcome respite from the city's cacophony, now felt like a held breath, waiting for the light to falter. 3. If you hear a voice call your name from outside, do not answer. It is not human. This one hit me like a physical blow. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden, profound stillness of the cabin. Not human. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. My mind immediately conjured images from old folklore, siren calls, forest spirits, things that lured travelers to their doom. Silas was clearly disturbed, I thought, trying to dismiss it. Paranoia born of isolation. But the tremor in my left hand, usually a subtle companion, now vibrated with an insistent urgency, mirroring the frantic beat of my pulse. I continued down the list, each rule more unsettling than the last. 4. The map in the bottom drawer is incomplete. Do not attempt to fill in the blank spaces. They are blank for a reason. I glanced at the small, locked drawer beneath the desk. A map. Incomplete. The idea of forbidden knowledge, of territories deliberately left uncharted, was profoundly unsettling. It implied a vastness, an unknowable expanse beyond the familiar, a reality that resisted human comprehension. What could be so terrible that it couldn't even be drawn? My meticulous nature, which craved order and completion, felt a perverse urge to open that drawer, to see the blank spaces for myself. But the warning, "They are blank for a reason," held me back, a cold hand on my wrist. 5. If you see movement in your peripheral vision, do not turn your head directly to face it. Observe it only through the corner of your eye. This rule was a masterpiece of psychological torment. It played directly into the primal fear of the unseen, the lurking presence just beyond the edge of perception. It forced me to question my own senses, to doubt the reliability of my vision. What if it's just a trick of the light? What if it's my own mind playing tricks? The very instruction to not look directly felt like a challenge, a perverse dare. I imagined myself, eyes fixed forward, while something shifted just outside my direct line of sight, a phantom presence that would never quite resolve into clarity. 6. The silence is not always empty. Sometimes it listens. Do not speak aloud after midnight unless absolutely necessary. The profound silence of the lookout had been one of its initial appeals. Now it was transformed into a sentient, predatory entity. It listens. The thought made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I found myself instinctively lowering my voice, even though I was alone. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a glass cage, every whisper potentially overheard, every thought laid bare to an unseen audience. This rule, more than any other, deepened the psychological horror, turning the very air I breathed into a potential threat. 7. If the radio goes dead, do not attempt to fix it. Wait for it to return on its own. Do not use the emergency satellite phone unless you are certain of a fire. This was a practical rule, yet imbued with a chilling undertone. The radio was my lifeline, my only connection to the outside world. The idea of it dying, of being truly cut off, was terrifying. But the instruction not to fix it, to simply wait, suggested that its failure might not be a malfunction, but a deliberate act. And the satellite phone, my last resort, was to be used only for fire, not for fear, not for a voice calling my name, not for things moving in the periphery, only for fire. It was a stark reminder of my isolation and the terrifying implication that some horrors were not considered emergencies by the outside world. 8. If you find an item out of place, do not touch it. Report it in the logbook, but do not restore it to its original position. My meticulous nature recoiled at this. My instinct was to immediately correct any disarray, to impose order. But this rule forbade it, turning a simple act of tidiness into a potential transgression. It implied an intelligence, a presence that was actively manipulating the environment, testing boundaries, or perhaps leaving messages. The thought of finding something subtly shifted, a book slightly ajar, a pen moved an inch, and being forced to leave it, to simply observe the violation of order, was a slow, agonizing form of torment. 9. The previous lookout, Silas, left for a reason. Do not seek to understand it. Do not follow his path. This was the most direct, and perhaps the most terrifying, rule of all. It confirmed my darkest suspicions about Silas, that his departure was not merely abrupt, but born of something truly horrific. It was a warning, a desperate plea from the past, but it also ignited a dangerous curiosity. What reason? What path? The human mind, mine especially, is wired to seek answers, to solve puzzles. This rule was a direct assault on that instinct, a forbidden door that now loomed large in my mind. As I finished reading, the cabin felt colder, the shadows deeper. The initial disbelief had given way to a pervasive sense of dread, a slow burn that seeped into my bones. This wasn't just a job. It was a test, a gauntlet laid down by a man who had clearly seen too much. The rules were a framework, yes, but a framework for a nightmare. They were designed not just to guide, but to terrify, to systematically strip away any sense of control or safety. I tried to dismiss them, to tell myself it was the ramblings of a madman. Silas was clearly unhinged by the isolation, I thought, trying to cling to the rational. It's just a story he made up to cope. But the very specificity of the rules, the chilling detail, argued against it. They felt too real, too tailored to this isolated environment. The first night was a slow, agonizing crawl. Every creak of the old timbers, every rustle of wind against the glass, was amplified, scrutinized through the lens of Silas's rules. I kept the emergency lantern burning, its feeble glow a small defiance against the overwhelming darkness outside. I found myself constantly checking my peripheral vision, my eyes darting, almost imperceptibly, to the edges of my sight, half expecting to catch a fleeting movement. Don't turn your head, I reminded myself, the rule echoing in my mind like a mantra. Around midnight, the silence deepened further, becoming absolute. It was the kind of silence that pressed in on your eardrums, making them ache. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, the rush of blood in my ears. The silence is not always empty. Sometimes it listens. The words replayed in my mind, a chilling whisper. I clamped my mouth shut, resisting the urge to speak, to break the oppressive stillness. My internal monologue became a torrent, a desperate attempt to rationalize, to dismiss, to simply think my way out of the growing terror. This is ridiculous, Elias. You're a lawyer, a man of logic. This is just a cabin, a forest. The isolation is getting to you, just like it got to Silas. There's nothing out there. Nothing. But even as I thought it, a part of me, a primal, terrified part, knew it was a lie. The air grew colder, despite the small wood, burning stove I'd lit. A bone, chilling coldness that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the lookout, seeping into my skin. I pulled my blanket tighter, but it offered no warmth against the creeping dread. Then, a sound. Faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. It seemed to come from below, from the base of the tower. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It wasn't the creaking of the wood, nor the sigh of the wind. It was distinct, deliberate. My breath hitched. I froze, every muscle tensed, straining to hear. The tapping continued, slow and steady, like a finger gently rapping against the wooden supports. Don't answer. It is not human. The rules screamed in my mind. My throat was dry, my tongue thick. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who was there, to break the terrifying silence. But Silas's words, etched into that yellowed paper, held me captive. I squeezed my eyes shut for a moment, then forced them open, staring into the oppressive darkness beyond the windows. The tapping continued, a relentless, maddening rhythm that seemed to mock my forced stillness. I reached for my journal, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold the pen. I had to record this. I had to document the unraveling. Rule 80. If you find an item out of place, do not touch it. Report it in the logbook, but do not restore it to its original position. This wasn't an item, but it was an anomaly, a violation of the expected. I wrote, my handwriting a shaky scrawl, night 1, approx. 12:37 a.m. Faint, rhythmic tapping from below, base of tower, did not respond. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it began. The silence that followed was even more profound, more terrifying than before. It felt heavy, pregnant with unseen things. I sat there, rigid, listening for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, a branch, an animal. But the rhythm had been too precise, too deliberate. It is not human. The words echoed, a chilling prophecy. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my chair, the emergency lantern a tiny, flickering island of light in a sea of encroaching dread. Every shadow seemed to deepen, to shift. Every creak of the tower was a potential movement. The vast, beautiful wilderness of Oregon, which had promised solace, had become a living, breathing entity of terror, its secrets guarded by a dead man's rules. And I, Elias Thorne, was trapped within its confines. Listening, the tapping from the base of the tower on that first night had been a prelude, a soft, insidious whisper of the horrors to come. It had stopped, yes, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was pregnant with unseen things, a heavy, listening presence that pressed in on me from all sides. I spent the remainder of that night, and the days that followed, in a state of heightened vigilance, every nerve ending frayed, every shadow a potential threat. My meticulous nature, once a source of comfort, now felt like a curse, forcing me to scrutinize every detail, every deviation from the norm. The rules, Silas's chilling legacy, had become my new scripture, a perverse guide to survival in a world that had suddenly turned hostile. I adhered to them with a desperate, almost religious fervor. I never left the lookout after sunset. I kept the emergency lantern burning, its feeble glow a constant, defiant pulse against the encroaching darkness. I spoke only when absolutely necessary, my voice a low murmur, my thoughts a frantic, silent monologue. Don't speak aloud after midnight unless absolutely necessary. The rule echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the listening silence. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of scanning the horizon for smoke, meticulously logging my observations, and then, as dusk approached, retreating into the cabin's fragile sanctuary. The sun, once a symbol of warmth and life, became a ticking clock, its descent marking the beginning of the true terror. Each sunset was a descent into a deeper, more profound isolation, a stripping away of the familiar world. The first minor rule I broke was almost accidental, a slip born of exhaustion and a desperate need for a semblance of normalcy. It was the third night. The tapping hadn't returned, but the silence had grown heavier, punctuated by faint, unidentifiable sounds, a distant rustle that wasn't wind, a soft scrape that wasn't the tower settling. I was trying to read, my eyes tracing the same line in a worn paperback for the 10th time, when a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the eastern window. It was the sound of wood splintering, sharp and immediate. My head snapped up. My eyes, wide and frantic, darted to the window, and there it was, a shadow. Not a shadow cast by the trees or the fading light, but a deeper, impossibly blacker void against the already dark glass. It was amorphous, shifting, yet undeniably present, clinging to the pane like a stain. My breath caught in my throat. Never looked directly at the shadow in the eastern window after sunset. The rule screamed in my mind, a cold accusatory voice. But I had already looked. My gaze had locked onto it, a primal, involuntary reaction to the sudden noise. A wave of nausea washed over me, a cold dread that settled deep in my stomach. The shadow seemed to pulse, to deepen, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, I thought I saw something within it, something that writhed and stretched, like tendrils of smoke reaching out. I tore my eyes away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Stupid. So stupid. My hands were shaking violently, the tremor in my left hand now a full-body convulsion. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it was burned into my retinas. When I opened them again, the shadow was gone. The window was just a window, reflecting the dim light of the lantern. But the splintered wood, a fresh, jagged line across the frame, was undeniable. It was real, and I had broken a rule. The consequence was immediate, though subtle. The air in the cabin grew colder, a pervasive chill that no amount of wood in the stove could dispel. It was a damp, clinging cold, like the breath of a tomb. And then, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but slowly, insidiously, they grew clearer, forming words. They weren't in English or any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, guttural murmur, filled with malice and a chilling, ancient hunger. They seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the air itself, pressing in on me, surrounding me. The silence is not always empty. Sometimes it listens. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The whispers were inside my head, a chorus of unseen voices that mocked my solitude. This is it, I thought, a desperate, frantic thought. This is how Silas went mad. This is how I go mad. The next rule I broke was born of desperation, a desperate attempt to regain a sliver of control. The radio, my only tenuous link to the outside world, had gone dead 2 days after the shadow incident. Just static, a flat, lifeless hiss. If the radio goes dead, do not attempt to fix it. Wait for it to return on its own. I had waited. For hours. For a full day. The silence of the cabin, broken only by the insidious whispers, was becoming unbearable. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I needed to hear a human voice, any voice, even if it was just a weather report. My mind, usually so disciplined, was fraying at the edges. This is ridiculous. It's a machine. Machines break. I can fix it. I ignored the cold dread that coiled in my gut, the insistent voice of Silas's rule. I grabbed my toolkit, my hands shaking, and began to dismantle the radio. The wires were tangled, the components dusty. I worked methodically, my legal training kicking in, the need to solve a problem overriding the primal fear. As I pulled a loose wire, a sharp, metallic tang filled the air, like ozone mixed with something else, something acrid and sickly sweet. Suddenly, the cabin plunged into darkness. The emergency lantern, which I had meticulously kept burning, flickered once, then died, plunging me into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The whispers, which had been a constant murmur, swelled into a deafening roar, a cacophony of guttural sounds that vibrated through my very bones. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair, the toolkit clattering to the floor. No, my internal scream was silent, swallowed by the overwhelming noise. I fumbled in the dark, my hands scrabbling for the lantern, for matches, for anything to bring back the light. The darkness was not empty. It was alive, a tangible presence that pressed in on me, suffocating me. I could feel it, a cold, unseen breath on my neck, a brush against my cheek. Then, the tapping returned, not from below, but from inside the cabin. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the wooden walls, moving, circling me in the absolute blackness. It was closer now, intimately close. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, through the very air. It is not human. My mind screamed. I scrambled backward, hitting the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping grew faster, more insistent, a frantic drumbeat that matched the terror in my chest. I could hear a faint, wet slithering sound accompanying it, like something dragging itself across the floor. Oh God! Oh God! I had to get the light. I had to. My fingers closed around the cold metal of the lantern. I fumbled for the matches, my hands slick with sweat. 1 strike. 2, 3. The tiny flame flared, illuminating a small circle of the cabin. The whispers immediately receded, shrinking back into the shadows, but they didn't disappear entirely. The tapping stopped, and then I saw it. On the floor, near where I had been working on the radio, was a trail. A glistening, viscous trail, like snail slime, but thicker, darker, almost black. It snaked across the floorboards, leading from the radio, across the room, and disappearing into the deepest shadows beneath the desk. It was fresh, and it was definitely not human. My stomach churned. I stared at the trail, my mind reeling. The radio was still dead. The lantern was burning, but its light felt weaker, as if the darkness itself was trying to consume it. I had broken 2 rules, and the consequences were escalating, becoming more direct, more terrifying. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I barely slept, haunted by the whispers, and the memory of the glistening trail. I ate sparingly, my appetite gone. My meticulousness had morphed into an obsessive need to monitor every detail, every sound, every shadow. I was no longer just observing. I was actively engaging with the threat, trying to understand it, to find a pattern, a weakness. One afternoon, driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity, I found myself staring at the bottom drawer of the desk. The map drawer. The map in the bottom drawer is incomplete. Do not attempt to fill in the blank spaces. They are blank for a reason. The rule had been a constant, nagging presence in my mind. What was so terrible about those blank spaces? What forbidden knowledge did they conceal? My legal mind, which thrived on uncovering hidden truths, found the prohibition unbearable. I had to know. I had to see. This is a mistake, Elias. A terrible mistake. My internal monologue was a frantic debate, a battle between logic and a burgeoning, terrifying curiosity. But the lure of the unknown, the need to understand Silas's madness, was too strong. I found the small, ornate key, hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the stove, exactly where Silas would have left it. My hands trembled as I inserted it into the lock. The click was unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. I pulled the drawer open. Inside, neatly folded, was a map. It was old, brittle in hand, drawn, depicting the Oregon wilderness surrounding the lookout. But just as the rule had stated, large sections of it were blank, stark white voids amidst the detailed topography. They weren't just empty spaces, they were deliberately empty, outlined with a faint, almost invisible pencil line, as if someone had intended to fill them in, then stopped abruptly. My eyes scanned the map, searching for clues. The marked areas showed familiar trails, rivers, and peaks. But the blank spaces, they were unsettlingly large, encompassing entire valleys and ridges. As I stared, a strange sensation washed over me, a feeling of profound disorientation. The lines of the map seemed to shift, to subtly warp, and for a moment, the blank spaces seemed to pulse, to breathe. Then, I saw it. In one of the largest blank areas, a faint, almost imperceptible symbol began to emerge. It wasn't drawn. It was as if the paper itself was absorbing ink from an unseen source, slowly, agonizingly revealing a pattern. It was a series of interlocking geometric shapes, intricate and alien, unlike anything I had ever seen. As it solidified, a cold, metallic taste filled my mouth, like old blood, and then the twist. The symbol wasn't just appearing on the map. It was appearing on my skin. A searing pain erupted on my left forearm. I cried out, dropping the map, which fluttered to the floor. I stared at my arm, horrified. There, etched into my skin, glowing with a faint, sickly green light, was the exact same symbol from the map. It wasn't a tattoo. It was as if the very fibers of my flesh, were rearranging themselves, forming the intricate pattern. The pain was excruciating, a burning, twisting agony that made me gasp. "Silas, what did you do?" The whispers in my head intensified, no longer just a murmur, but a chorus of triumphant, guttural sounds. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and decay. The cabin seemed to groan around me, the timbers twisting, the glass in the windows vibrating with an unseen force. The emergency lantern flickered wildly, threatening to die again. I stumbled backward, clutching my arm, my mind reeling. This wasn't just a haunting. This wasn't just a set of rules. This was a ritual. Silas hadn't just left a warning, he had left a legacy. He hadn't just gone mad, he had been changed. And the rules weren't just precautions. They were instructions. Instructions for something. The symbol on my arm pulsed, the green light growing brighter, casting an eerie glow on the cabin walls. I looked at the map on the floor, then back at my arm. The blank spaces. The reason they were blank. They weren't empty because nothing was there. They were empty because something was waiting to be drawn. And now, it was drawing itself. On me, a new understanding, cold and terrifying, washed over me. Silas hadn't just been a victim. He had been a participant. Perhaps unwillingly, perhaps unknowingly at first, but a participant nonetheless. And now, I was too. The rules weren't meant to protect me from the entity. They were meant to guide the entity, to prepare me, to transform me. The climax was upon me. The whispers coalesced, forming a single, resonant hum that vibrated through the entire lookout. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The symbol on my arm burned, a living brand. I was no longer just a fire lookout. I was a canvas, a vessel. And the true horror, the one Silas had tried to warn me about, not with words, but with a list of rules, was finally revealing itself. It wasn't just outside. It was inside. And it was using me to complete its map. I looked out the window, not at the darkness, but at the vast, indifferent forest. It was no longer a place of solace, but a sprawling, ancient entity, its roots reaching deep into something unspeakable. And I was now inextricably linked to it, a new, unwilling piece in its terrifying, unfolding design. The silence outside was no longer just listening. It was waiting, waiting for me to complete the map, waiting for me to become one of its blank spaces. The searing pain on my left forearm was a constant, throbbing reminder. The symbol, intricate and alien, pulsed with a faint, sickly green light, a living brand etched into my flesh. It was no longer just a mark. It was a connection, a conduit to something ancient and unspeakable that now resided within me. The climax had passed, the immediate terror of the entity's manifestation receding like a tide, but it had left behind a profound, indelible mark on my world and on my very being. The cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The air was thick with the lingering scent of ozone and decay, a stench that seemed to cling to my clothes, to my skin. The emergency lantern, miraculously, still flickered, its light a weak, desperate pulse against the oppressive gloom. But its warmth offered no comfort against the bone, chilling cold that had settled deep within the lookout. A cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the very air I breathed. I stumbled away from the desk, my legs weak, my mind reeling. The map lay on the floor where I had dropped it, its blank spaces no longer pristine. The symbol, now fully formed, seemed to writhe on the brittle paper, mirroring the burning agony on my arm. It's complete, I thought, a chilling realization. The map is complete, and I am part of it. The whispers, though no longer a deafening roar, had not vanished. They had receded, yes, but they were still there, a low, guttural murmur, that seemed to resonate from the deepest corners of my mind. They were no longer just external sounds, they were internal, a constant, insidious chorus that mocked my solitude, that questioned my sanity. Are they real? Or is this the isolation finally breaking me? The sun rose hours later, a pale, indifferent orb in a sky that seemed too bright, too normal after the horrors of the night. Its light, usually a source of relief, now felt harsh, exposing the raw, visceral truth of what had transpired. I looked at my arm, the symbol still glowing faintly, even in the daylight. It was real. The pain was real. The fear was real. But the whispers, they were still there, a constant, unsettling hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. I tried to rationalize, to cling to the remnants of my logical mind. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced psychosis. The isolation, it's finally gotten to me. But the splintered wood on the eastern window, the glistening trail on the floor, the dead radio, and most damningly, the burning symbol on my arm, argued against it. These were tangible proofs, anchors in a reality that had been irrevocably shattered. My meticulous nature, once my greatest strength, had become my undoing. It had compelled me to seek answers, to fill in the blanks, to understand the rules. And in doing so, I had walked directly into the trap Silas had either set or had been forced to set. Silas, what happened to you? Did you complete the map too? Did you become this? The thought was a cold, sharp blade twisting in my gut. The days that followed were a blur of profound exhaustion and escalating paranoia. I performed my duties mechanically, scanning the horizon for fires, but my gaze was constantly drawn to the edges of my vision, to the shadows that seemed to deepen even in broad daylight. Every creak of the tower, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a jolt of terror through me. I was no longer just a fire lookout. I was a prisoner, bound by a set of rules that had become a living, breathing entity, a malevolent force that had claimed me. I found myself talking to the whispers, arguing with them, pleading with them to leave me alone. My voice, usually steady, was now a hoarse whisper, a desperate plea in the vast, empty silence of the lookout. Don't speak aloud after midnight, unless absolutely necessary. The rule was a cruel joke now. Necessity had become a constant companion. The unreliable narrator was no longer a literary device. It was my reality. I questioned everything. Was the symbol on my arm truly glowing? Or was it just a trick of the light, a figment of my deteriorating mind? Were the whispers real, or were they the echoes of my own descent into madness? The ambiguity was a torment, a constant, gnawing uncertainty that left me perpetually on edge. I began to see things, fleeting movements in my peripheral vision that vanished when I tried to focus. Shadows that stretched and writhed, forming grotesque shapes against the walls. The trees outside seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers, beckoning me into the depths of the forest. They are blank for a reason. The map's warning now felt like a promise, a terrifying invitation to become one with the unknown. My physical appearance began to reflect my internal turmoil. My eyes were sunken, bloodshot from lack of sleep. My face was gaunt, my skin pale. The tremor in my left hand was now a constant, violent shaking that made even holding a pen a struggle. I was a ghost of my former self, a man stripped down to raw fear, haunted by an entity that had taken root within me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, I found myself standing by the eastern window. The shadow, the one I had looked at directly, the one that had started it all, began to form again. It was deeper, more defined now, almost solid, and this time I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. Instead, I raised my left arm, the symbol on my forearm pulsing with a brighter, more vibrant green light. It seemed to resonate with the shadow, a silent communication, a terrifying acknowledgement. The whispers in my head swelled, not with malice, but with a strange, unsettling sense of anticipation. It wants me to complete it, to become it. The thought was clear, chillingly precise. The map wasn't just a drawing, it was a blueprint. And I was the final piece. Silas had left the rules not as a warning to escape, but as a guide for the next host. A twisted inheritance passed down through the lookouts. He hadn't escaped, he had merely passed the torch, or perhaps the curse. I looked out at the vast, indifferent wilderness, the endless expanse of trees that stretched to the horizon. It was no longer just a forest. It was a living, breathing entity, its roots reaching deep into something unspeakable, and I was now inextricably linked to it, a new, unwilling piece in its terrifying, unfolding design. The silence outside was no longer just listening, it was waiting. Waiting for me to complete the map, waiting for me to become one of its blank spaces. The final rule, the one about Silas, echoed in my mind. Do not seek to understand it. Do not follow his path. But I had sought to understand, and in doing so, I had followed his path, straight into the heart of the horror. And now, there was no turning back. The last entry in my logbook, scrawled in a hand that was barely recognizable as my own, read, day, hey unknown. The map is almost complete. The whispers are louder now. They are telling me things. Things about the forest, things about Silas, things about what comes next. I understand now. I understand everything. And it is far worse than I could have ever imagined. I closed the logbook, the sound of faint thud in the overwhelming silence. The symbol on my arm burned, a constant, agonizing reminder of my new reality. The lookout, once a symbol of escape, was now my prison and my grave. The horror wasn't over. It had merely begun a new chapter, one that would be written not in ink, but in the very fibers of my being. Good luck falling asleep afterward. The thought was not my own. It was a whisper, a chilling, final note from the chorus in my mind, a promise of eternal dread.